The education of Africans has always revolved around education for servitude. That has not changed one whit. I have warned in Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children that the main purpose of education is not preparing black children for jobs. It is not preparing them to work for white folk. That is not the main purpose of the education of our children or our people. For if that is our main purpose, then it means another constant has remained in the world, and that's the constant of slavery under a different name. Now it's called looking for a job, with the same people having the jobs and the same people determining our wages. If you're talking about true change in the world, then you must educate yourself to create your own jobs and to employ yourself. But today, education for blacks, I don't care how high it is essentially still being defined in terms of servitude. And we think, when we are educated, in terms of how and where we will be employed by Europeans. That has to change. But the education of black people from 1619 right to this very moment has had this as a central tenet: training black folk to serve white folks' interest. Training black folk to be as productive as possible for Europeans, with the Europeans owning the means of production. Education that was separate and unequal. And believe me, I'm not an advocate of integrated education. Education that was ultimately and is ultimately degrading to black people has not changed. It was that way from the beginning, and is that way right now. Education that ultimately insults the history and culture of African people. Education that is Eurocentric, meaning an education that prepares black people to maintain European power as the central power in the world. Education of black people according to the white man's estimation of black intelligence and his need to shape and direct it. I've warned you before that you need to change the definition of intelligence before you get into an argument with Europeans as to whether their tests are measuring intelligence or not. You must ask, what is the political function of your definition of intelligence? What is the political economy of your definition of intelligence? And why is it that the way you define intelligence always ends up that means intelligent people work for you and your interest? So consequently then, we must recognize as an African people that the ultimate goal of intelligence must be that of preparing a people to solve their problems. The way intelligence is defined today and in America is such that if we as African people are said to behave intelligently, we are behaving in ways to perpetuate our oppression and to maintain European power over us. And therefore it becomes important to the European to define what intelligence is and to define how it is measured, and for us to engage in futile arguments as to whether it's caused by cultural differences or genetic differences, when it really is not even the point. According to Henry Allen Bullock, author of A History of Negro Education in the South from 1619 to the present, in the beginning there was no thought of educating Negroes. Yet the necessity to do so was always present. You see, ultimately the white man is faced with a dilemma. In his heart and way, he would not like to educate us but the very structure and demands and dynamics of his economic system in a way forces him to do so. And so even though he had no intentions, and you can see in the history books some overt statements about not educating blacks, and of course if you read the history of Frederick Douglass, you saw the issue there of the slave master and his reading abilities, what kind of problems they created. But in a sense, the white man's education of the African man under white supremacy has been very ambivalent, both intentional and non-intentional. Bullock goes on to say that soon after the establishment of the slave regime in the American South, there was set in motion unintentional processes destined to introduce the first of many educational opportunities that Negroes were to have prior to the Civil War. Because we must recognize that the plantation system and the slave system was what we call a rational system, in the sense that it was an organized economic system and operated according to definite goals and intentions. And another expression of rational business practice in terms of the slave system of the South appeared in the attempts of planters to utilize their labor efficiently, you see. So if you've got an economic system, whether that system is called slavery or not, ultimately you want to make it function efficiently to get the greatest bang for the buck. A complex system of division of slave labor was instituted on every plantation, and all of this was done in pursuit of maximum production per unit of slave labor. If you would read the magazines during this period, you will see great discussions as to how to maximize production on the plantation, how to relate to the slaves, how to train them, and how to motivate them so as to maximize profits. So within the broad limits of this rational system, he, the slave master, was expected to require and get absolute obedience, loyalty, docility, diligence, and other patterns of behavior considered essential for profitable production and survival of the slavery economy. Another constant that has not changed, has it? Not at all. For, ladies and gentlemen, this is the central essence of the education of African Americans today. To maximize what? Production for Europeans, and to establish in the African body absolute obedience, loyalty, docility, diligence, and other patterns of behavior considered essential for whom? For Africans themselves? No, profitable for production and survival of the European economy. That's why we define ourselves in terms of our education as preparing to get jobs from Europeans, and how best to what? Qualify ourselves to fit in the European economy so that we can aid its efficiency. The laws of every slave state backed the normative line which he, the master, could draw, and every slave was expected to fear the consequences of any deviation from the range of tolerance his master set. And we shall see again, these rules that determine special education still have these things in mind, because these rules are rules that determine deviancy and non-deviancy. And their purpose is to correct deviant black behavior and bring it back in line with European economic and political intentions, and to create in our children personality orientations and behavioral orientations that are supportive of those intentions. These requirements, that is, set up by the European, set a rigorous socio-cultural matrix within which young Negroes were to be socialized and were to become the personality types required by the rational order. And we're going to come back in a minute to what we call the political economy of the personality. and the political economy of normality, you see, because we are used to looking at normality as a psychological concept and a psychological state. No, ladies and gentlemen, normality essentially is a political and economic state, not a state of psychology. So however, we've been deceived, you see. But we'll get back to that in a minute. All the slaves could not be efficiently utilized as the rational system required unless they were trained in the ways the system by law itself prohibited it. In a sense, the system broke its own laws in order to increase its efficiency. And even though it might have had laws against teaching slaves to read, slaves still were taught to read. And teaching slaves other things, slaves learned many skills and so forth. Why? And in a sense then, slaves started their education on the job in America and received on-the-job training. They also were hired out in other professions where they earned monies for their masters and brought the money back. With all due respect to Malcolm X, there were greater divisions than field hands and house servants. There were deep hierarchies of slaves with numbers of skills and so forth. The slaves not only worked in the house, or not only worked in the fields, but they worked throughout the Southern economy. They were millwrights and carpenters and blacksmiths and shipbuilders and all other kinds of things you could name. You recognize that in many areas of the South after the emancipation, there were more skilled black laborers than there were white laborers as a result of their training on the plantations. And that is a whole nother story. And it's amusing today to see people talk about black people as unskilled, as if our lack of skills were here since we started. That was not the case. We had to be de-skilled as a people in this country. And those skills began right on the plantation. We were hired out. In a sense then, the plantation was the first training school for African people. And to a great degree, the slave masters recognized, as they do today, that a trained slave could sell for more on the marketplace. And therefore, when you went on the auction block, the more skills you had, the more he could fetch for you. In fact, some of the skills were developed as an investment so that when the slave was sold, he would bring more than was invested in it. Sounds like today, ladies and gentlemen? Sounds like this kind of thing when we are told and we tell our children to build your marketable skills so that when you go on the auction block in front of your white employers, you can demand a higher price because you can project the skills that he has set in you. What do the French tell us? The more things change, the more they remain the same. And this capacity we must maintain, or else we will be deceived by superficial changes, as so many of our people are. Some of you heard me on the radio this morning. You heard some references to Colin Powell as representing some advancement for African people. And yet those of us who have a little knowledge of African history and of the history of the Byzantine Empire know very clearly that there were slave generals. Yes, generals who led massive armies who were slaves. And despite the fact that they were generals and led imperial armies, they were slaves just the same. So the idea then that you're going to have an African man under the power of European and white supremacy being a general, that he represents some kind of power and advancement for black people, is a delusion. And I'm certain, if you read people even like Chancellor Williams, and God bless his soul and rest his soul, who talks about those Africanized Arabs also leading those armies against whom? Other Africans. So let's not get carried away about black man being ahead of the U.S. Armed Forces, ladies and gentlemen. Because essentially he's going to play the same role that we've always played when we were promoted to these second-hand positions. That is leading aggression against our own people.